This film comprised of making two masters from two-part moulds. You might ask why two masters? Well, the reason is one for the outline shape, the second one for the detail. The detailed master would be used for the injection mould. I'm going to start by using an old casting and stripping it down by cutting the fins and the tail off. Once the lure has been stripped, I mark it and cut it into 3 sections, cutting each section at an angle. Out of sheet polyester, I cut the shape of the lure. The reason I use the sheet polyester is because it creates a centre line. This allows me to get all the fins in the correct position, the head in the correct position, and also get the whole lure symmetrical. Each section of the old casting is cut in half, straight down the centre. Using my multi-tool, I cut a slot straight down the centre of the head section. Using a 5-minute epoxy, I stick all the sections to the sheet polyester. Once the epoxy is fully dried, using wood filler, I start to create the profile of the lure. Just filling out the lure and then sanding, and then continue to fill and sand until I get the profile of the lure I want. The reason I use a wood filler because it's easy to work with, dries quickly, and leaves a very fine finish. Once the body profile has been achieved, I then start to work on the head. For this I use milliput, a 2-part putty. Milliput is really simple to use. You just mould the 2 parts together and then basically fill or create your shape. Using water, just smooth over the top and then allow to dry. Once the milliput is dried, you can do anything with it. Sand it, cut it, file it and carve it. I cut slots for the fins. Then out of the sheet polyester, I cut the shape of the fins. Using a 5-minute epoxy, I stick the fins in position, making sure they're in line and they're symmetrical. Epoxy is dried, I then fill any gaps using the wood filler and sand. Using a small piece of milliput, I create the final fin. Using an acrylic primer spray paint, I whitewash the lure. Basically what this does is it brings out any defects and then I sand those again and then respray to get a lovely smooth finish. And there we have it, our first master finish for our first mould. This master can now be used again and again. We're going to create a two-part silicone mould using RTV silicone, but to create the box in the mould we're going to use Lego and plasticine. I use the Lego to build up the walls of the mould box. Once I've got the walls of the mould box to the required height, I then filled with plasticine, and then using a piece of copper tube I basically just roll out the plasticine to level it out and smooth it out. I'll build the mould box up one more course of Lego bricks and then cut the master into the plasticine. I continue to build up the mould box using Lego blocks and then using a pen I make indentations into the plasticine. These are basically there for when the mould is actually made. It basically interlocks the two parts of the mould together. Using a mould release I brush it over the master, the plasticine and around the edges of the walls of the mould. I start to thoroughly mix the silicone rubber. Once the silicone has been thoroughly mixed, it can be poured into the mould box over the master, slightly covering it, this allowing the air bubbles to release. Once the air bubbles are released, more silicone can be added. I add small pieces of silicone from previous projects to the final pour of the mould. I'm basically using these small pieces of silicone just to bulk out the mould, making it cheaper to make. I leave the silicone to cure for 24 hours. After 24 hours and the silicone is cured, I turn the mould over, remove the plasticine and then brush over the top of the silicone with Vaseline, which I use as a mould release, making sure not to get it onto the actual master. Silicone loves to stick to silicone, so don't forget to put a mould release, a barrier between the two parts of the mould. Pour in the silicone exactly the same way as you poured the first part of the mould. After a further 24 hours, the mould box can be stripped and then the two parts of the mould separated. And there we have it, the first mould completed, ready for pouring. This mould can now be used for multiple projects. Place pieces of stainless steel wire in the mould to strengthen the master when it's cast out of resin. Pieces of wood and elastic bands are used to keep the mould together and keep the strength of the mould there and keep it rigid. To make the resin master, I'm using Featherlight, a two-part resin. It has to be thoroughly mixed together, equal portions. Once the resin has been fully mixed, it can be poured into the mould, expelling any air. It can be left for 3 hours before you demould, and then a further 24 hours for it to cure. Once we're at the demould stage, we can take the resin master out of the mould and sand any rough edges. I sand and fill out the main tail fin. Using a pencil and a sharp knife, I mark out and cut the gills. Using a file and a very fine saw, I create the tail fin. Using the same carving process, I'll do the remaining fins. Using the fine saw, the file, a straight edge and a bowl, I create the lateral line. Tool, I cut a slot into the bottom of the lure or the master for where the hook or the modifier will sit. Holes are drilled for where the soft plastic fins will sit. A straight line is drawn for where I want the scale pattern to start. Then using a half round carving tool, I start to create the scales. After a couple of hours, a scale pattern is created. A hole is drilled in the bottom of the master where the pour hole or the injection hole for the soft plastic is going to be. I drill a hole in the mouth and insert a piece of plastic tube where the line through is going to go. I make an injection mould box out of wood for the injection mould to sit in. The mould box sits onto a levelling platform which comprises of 4 screws and a flat piece of wood. The 4 screws are used to level the mould box. As previous, I cut up loads of small pieces of silicone from previous projects and basically I use that to bulk out the mould. The master and injector is fitted into place. The silicone is gradually poured into the mould, allowing all small air bubbles to escape. I've decided not to use plastisol for this mould due to the fact that I've got very fine detailed scales and I don't want to ruin the scales. After 24 hours, the process is repeated on the opposite side, remembering to use a mould release. After 24 hours, the mould can be separated and the master taken out. And that's our mould produced, ready for injecting. As you can see, because I didn't use a mould release on the lure master, I struggled to get the actual master out to the mould and it ended up breaking. I pour resin into a container to form a block. I then use this block of resin to make the weight stroke float. Using a saw, sandpaper, I create the shape of the float. I drill holes and insert plastic tubes where I want the line throughs to go. I make 2 of these, one for a moderate sink and one for a slow sink. I create another 2-part mould ready for moulding.
Pacing back and forth. I don't understand why you're standing right here. All your shots have scored. No, scratching at the scars you left on my skin. But we fight and we fall and we rise through it all till we find what we want.
Once the moulds are made ready for casting, I add weight or cut weight and add plastic tubes. I add a bent piece of tube for a slow sink and a straight piece of tube for a moderate sink. Obviously with a moderate sink we have a heavier weight, which is about 35 grams, and for the slow sink I have a lighter weight, which is around 25 grams. A slot is cut at the end where the lure strengthening material will be fixed. The material is cut, doubled over, stretched, and then fixed into place using a bit of epoxy resin. Small pieces of wire are placed inside the tubes. This allows the actual weight stroke float to be attached to the edge of the mould. The material is fixed at the end of the mould by using a small piece of wire. Onto the injection moulding. So I clamp the mould together and then heat up my soft plastisol. I heat it to about 170 degrees, 180 degrees, let it cool down to about 165 degrees, and then inject it into the mould. The first attempt was a total disaster. Basically my injector was too small and my expansion chamber was too big. After the first attempt was pretty poor, I made some alterations to the mould. I created some more air ducts and made the expansion chamber smaller. I also had to increase the injector size. So before I waste a load of plastisol making a load more lures, I take 2 lures out, a moderate and a slow sink, for a swim test. And to be fair, they swim pretty well. I now have to make the pectoral fins. This stage comprises of making 2 moulds. I use milliput to create the first master. Then I'll make the master out of resin. Using some sandpaper, I create the shape of the pectoral fins. Using a fine saw, I create the fins. Using dowel, I create the injection tubes. I then make the two-part injection mould. I then heat the plastisol and inject into the mould, creating the fins. The surface of the lures are cleaned, ready for painting. Now it's ready for the fun bit, painting the lures. For this, I use soft bait paints from Cab Coatings. These are an absolutely awesome paint that stick well to the soft plastic, especially designed for painting lures. Once I finish painting, I use super glue to stick the eyes and the fins in position. Now we've got some pretty awesome looking lures. All we've got to do now is rig them. I make a modifier out of stainless steel wire for rigging the lure. To make this, I use a set of jewellery pliers. There's quite a few different variations of how you can rig this lure. I'll just leave you with 3. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe, and see you in the next film.